In southeastern Turkey, beneath a barren ridge, sits Göbekli Tepe. It is an impossible sight, an undeniable physical trace that simply refuses to fit the accepted story of human origins. Its oldest and deepest enclosures are built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, towering over the dry earth. They were quarried, perfectly balanced, and erected 12,000 years ago. This is an era before the invention of the wheel, before the firing of pottery, and long before the alleged dawn of agriculture. To truly grasp the scale of this historical fracture, you must understand what discovering these stones actually means. Unearthing Göbekli Tepe at this specific point in the human timeline is like digging into a Stone Age sediment layer and pulling out the precision-machined parts of a modern combustion engine. It defies the fundamental laws of linear progress, but the stones are entirely real, and they appear out of nowhere. The archaeological record shows absolutely no local developmental sequence. There are no earlier, cruder monuments nearby, no signs of trial and error leading up to this level of mastery. The sanctuary arrived fully formed, introducing sophisticated three-dimensional animal reliefs and profound architectural geometry into a world supposedly populated only by primitive nomads. And then, it suffered a fate just as strange as its sudden arrival. After an unknown period of use, the complex was not simply abandoned to the wind and the elements. It was intentionally entombed. The builders systematically buried the entire site under thousands of tons of carefully placed earth and stone fill, sealing it away in the dark. We are told by the official timeline that the people walking the earth 12,000 years ago were simple hunter-gatherers, living day to day in small, fragmented groups. But a scattered band of foragers could not have organised the hundreds of specialised workers required to cut, transport and align 20-ton megaliths. They could not have orchestrated the complex logistics, the feeding of a massive labour force, or the precise geometric vision required to construct and then deliberately bury such a colossal monument. This is not a primitive anomaly. This is an inheritance. Yet, mainstream institutions insist that the advanced civilization required to execute such a feat never existed. The official story demands that we view these stones in isolation, forcing an impossible level of engineering into a rigid timeline that refuses to bend. They tell us that human development is a straight, unbroken line of progress, and that no highly organized society could have possibly lived before us. The sheer weight of Göbekli Tepe shatters that clean, comfortable narrative. The accumulating pressure of this physical evidence reveals that our history is missing a massive foundational layer. The timeline has been broken. The memory of who we really are and who taught us to build has been buried, perhaps deliberately erased. We are looking at the remnants of a vanished world, a world that somehow survived the flood and the great reset of antiquity. And the most unsettling truth is not that this single sanctuary exists in the hills of Turkey. It is the realization that Göbekli Tepe is only the first clue. As we pull back the layers of the dirt, we find that this impossible architecture is not an isolated phenomenon. It is the surviving signature of a forgotten worldwide web. 5,000 miles away from the buried pillars of Turkey, deep in the volcanic highlands of West Java, Indonesia, lies another impossible trace: Gunung Padang. On the surface, the site looks like a natural hill covered in scattered volcanic rock, but the terrain is deceiving. It is not a mountain, it is a massive stepped pyramid, and the deepest layers of this monument do not date to the dawn of agriculture. According to extensive geological surveys, the oldest foundations of Gunung Padang date back to 20,000 BCE. For decades, the official story dismissed this site as a natural formation, modified slightly by local tribes. But the Earth has a memory, and modern instruments can read its buried layers. Geologists deployed ground-penetrating radar and core drilling to look beneath the surface. They mapped the interior by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground, and they drove hollow steel tubes deep into the soil to pull up physical cross-sections of the hidden rock. What they dragged back into the light was not solid bedrock. They found carefully engineered stone chambers. They found massive basalt columns laid by human hands, and they found multiple phases of construction, stretching down into the Ice Age. Gunung Padang is a staggering discovery, but it is not an isolated anomaly. It is one anchor in a much larger missing layer of history. If we pull back the lens, the comfortable map of the ancient world begins to look entirely different. Across the Pacific Ocean, The submerged terraces of the Yonaguni Monument in Japan echo the exact same monumental ambition. In the remote waters of Micronesia, the basalt log city of Nanmadol rests impossibly on a coral reef. Halfway across the world, the ancient perfectly planned grid of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan rises from the dust. We are looking at the remnants of a global megalithic network. At this stage, we must define the boundaries of what we are actually seeing. We are not looking at a random collection of interesting ruins. We are looking at a unified global pattern. This is an orientation lock for our investigation. The official timeline asks us to believe that primitive disconnected tribes woke up one morning and accidentally decided to build with identical, monumental genius. But the physical reality of these structures creates a pressure that the official story cannot hold. It is fundamentally impossible for isolated hunter-gatherers, separated by vast impassable oceans and thousands of years of silence, to independently invent the exact same megalithic techniques. They share the same staggering astronomical alignments. They share the same stepped pyramid architecture. They share the same impossible weights. A worldwide network of monuments built with the exact same architectural signatures implies only one logical conclusion. The evidence suggests there was a single advanced source civilization. They were a people who existed long before us. A forgotten culture that mapped the entire globe, shared a unified scientific blueprint and left their inheritance in stone before they were erased. To understand who they really were, we cannot just look at the size of their temples. We must look closer at the stones themselves, because the ultimate proof of their true nature is locked inside the elegant physics of how these massive blocks were actually shaped. The global pattern of impossible architecture does not stay buried in the earth. High in the Andes of Peru, it stands completely exposed in the sun. This is Sacsayhuamán. Here, walls of polygonal masonry stretch across the landscape, built from limestone and andesite blocks of staggering size. Some of these individual foundation stones are so massive they weigh up to 200 tons. To understand the true anomaly of this site, you have to look closely at the seams. These stones are not stacked with mortar, nor are they uniform. They are fitted together dry, locked into place with a precision that defies our understanding of the ancient world. The joints between these massive irregular blocks are so flawlessly tight that you cannot slide a single piece of paper or even the edge of a razor blade into the gaps. This is not the simple stacking of square bricks. The blocks are cut into strange, interlocking, curved shapes. Some individual stones feature a dozen different angles, perfectly sculpted to hug their neighbours in a complex three-dimensional puzzle. The accepted historical narrative tells us that this was accomplished with primitive tools. We are asked to believe that workers shaped these multi-ton stones using nothing but copper chisels, stone pounders, and endless trial and error. But there is a deep fracture between the official timeline and the physical reality of the stone. Mainstream archaeology explicitly attributes Sacsayhuamán to the Inca Empire, dating the construction to roughly the year 1400. The physical evidence refuses to behave. Andesite is an incredibly dense rock. A copper chisel cannot cut it. The metal would simply bend and blunt upon impact. When early chroniclers asked the Inca how they built these walls, the locals stated clearly that the megaliths were already there. The Inca built upon this site, adding their own smaller, cruder stonework on top of the megalithic foundation. They inherited the site. They did not create it. The true scale of the problem becomes clear when we look at it through the lens of modern engineering. Even today, bringing a 200-ton block out of a quarry, dragging it across mountainous terrain, and lifting it into a wall requires massive hydraulic machinery. But at Sacsayhuamán, the builders did not just move these weights. They suspended them, shaped them to microscopic tolerances, and set them down in a flawless earthquake-proof embrace. Modern engineers admit that replicating this exact architecture today would be a monumental struggle, even with laser-guided diamond saws. The evidence suggests we are looking at something entirely different. This interlocking, mortarless perfection is a signature. It is the physical fingerprint of a highly advanced source civilization, a global network of master builders who possessed an understanding of physics and material science that we are only beginning to comprehend. They designed monuments meant to outlast time itself, and yet they are gone. Their walls survived, but the people who moved the 200-ton stones did not. If a civilization was capable of engineering structures that are virtually indestructible, we are left with a terrifying question. What kind of planetary cataclysm was violent enough to wipe the builders from the face of the Earth? The official timeline of human history relies on a comforting assumption. We are told that the transition out of the last ice age was a gradual, quiet awakening. The glaciers slowly melted, the climate warmed, and primitive hunter-gatherers steadily marched towards civilization. But the physical record beneath our feet refuses to support that gentle story. If you dig deep enough into the Earth, across 4 different continents, you will hit a distinct, dark boundary layer. It marks a very specific date in the geological record, 12,800 years ago. This is known as the Younger Dryas impact boundary. And it does not record a slow climate shift. It records the exact moment the world ended. To geologists, this thin black mat is a forensic crime scene. It is laced with soot, iridium, platinum, and microscopic nanodiamonds. Nanodiamonds do not form in typical forest fires. They require the unimaginable heat and shock pressure of a cosmic impact. The evidence suggests that a massive comet, or a swarm of comet fragments, struck the ice sheets of the northern hemisphere. The result was a sudden planetary firestorm. The kinetic heat would have ignited entire continents in a matter of hours. The impact instantly melted massive volumes of glacial ice, sending a catastrophic pulse of freezing water across the globe, while simultaneously plunging the Earth back into a deep, dark freeze. The archaeological record on either side of this black layer is violently different. Below the boundary, the Americas were teeming with giant megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths roamed alongside a thriving human population known as the Clovis culture. Above the boundary, they are simply gone. The Clovis culture vanishes overnight. Over 100 species of large animals are instantly wiped from the fossil record. It is an extinction event so sudden and so absolute that it shatters any model of gradual change. This geological trauma is not just a tragedy of lost animals and early nomads. It is the missing context for our impossible stones. If a civilization of master builders was erecting polygonal walls and 20-ton pillars before this moment, this is the exact force that erased them. The comet strike of the Younger Dryas provides the physical mechanism needed to wash away a global network of advanced cities. The melting ice would have raised sea levels by hundreds of feet in an absolute instant, drowning coastal centres and burying their legacy under oceans of mud. This black layer in the soil is the hard boundary of a global reset. It is the dividing line that separates the advanced pre-flood world from the scattered remnants of our current cycle. Everything we call recorded history began long after this line was drawn. We are not looking at the dawn of human achievement. We are looking at what managed to grow back in the ashes. Yet, the most haunting piece of evidence for this cataclysm is not the platinum in the dirt or the nanodiamonds in the ice. It is the fact that human beings survived to talk about it. The Earth kept a geological scar, but the survivors kept a memory. And as we look across the oceans, we find that almost every ancient culture on the planet inherited the exact same story. The Epic of Gilgamesh does not end as a simple poem. On Tablet 11, pressed into baked clay dating to the 7th century BCE, the text preserves a physical trace of something much darker. It records the story of Utnapishtim, an ancient king who survived a great flood that erased the world before us. When you read the translation of the cuneiform script, it describes the skies turning black, the land shattering like a clay pot, and the gods themselves weeping in terror at the destruction they had unleashed. We are taught by modern scholars to read this as a religious allegory. We are told it is a primitive attempt to explain seasonal river flooding. But when you look closely at the language of the text, it reads entirely differently. It reads like a severe trauma response. It is a precise survival record, a desperate warning passed down by people who watched the oceans literally swallow a forgotten civilization. And this memory is not isolated to ancient Mesopotamia. If you examine the archives of human history, over 200 separate, disconnected cultures share the exact same narrative. From the biblical Genesis account of Noah, to the Hindu Matsya Purana, to the Mayan Popol Vuh, to the oral traditions of indigenous tribes in the Americas, the structural details refuse to change. They all describe an advanced, corrupt previous world. They all describe a sudden, violent destruction by an overwhelming wall of water. And they all speak of a handful of survivors, chosen to build boats and preserve the seed of humanity. For centuries, academia dismissed this staggering consistency as a shared psychological archetype. They assumed that isolated peoples simply imagined the same nightmare. But the physical Earth tells a decidedly different story. 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas comet impact triggered a massive planetary melting of the ice sheets. Geological records show a sudden catastrophic rise in global sea levels, known in the scientific literature as meltwater pulse 1A. The physical boundary layer of soot, platinum, and nanodiamonds perfectly matches the timeline of these deeply held human narratives. The waters rose hundreds of feet in a matter of days, drowning entire coastlines and wiping out whatever existed there. Isolated tribes, separated by thousands of miles of impassable oceans, do not independently hallucinate the exact same global drowning. They do not accidentally invent the exact same chronological mechanism of destruction. The inescapable conclusion is that these stories are not mythology at all. They are the most accurate historical record we possess of the Great Reset. They are the fragmented, living memory of the cataclysm that wiped out the advanced megalithic builders. The physical evidence buried in the dirt and the oral traditions passed down through generations are telling the exact same story. The waters eventually receded, the earth stabilized, but the true mystery is not merely what was lost beneath the thick layers of mud and silt. The mystery is what survived. If the official timeline is a fragment, and the flood was entirely real, we must ask exactly who walked out of those floodwaters. Who were the specific beings that retained the knowledge of the old world, and who taught the shattered remnants of humanity how to rebuild stone by stone? When the waters of the Great Flood finally receded, they left a fractured world. But the humans who survived did not rebuild civilization alone. The Book of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 4, preserves a strange fragmented memory of this time. It speaks of the Nephilim. It says that in those days, mighty men who were of old, men of renown, walked the earth before us. For centuries, institutions have taught us to read this as pure religious allegory. If this story existed only among a single desert tribe, it would be entirely safe to dismiss it as local folklore. But it does not. It appears everywhere. You can think of it as a shared cultural fingerprint. When the same highly specific detail is found simultaneously at the origins of every ancient civilization, it stops being a coincidence. It becomes a forensic trace of a physical reality. Across the globe, human memory insists on the exact same impossible narrative. From the ancient Sumerian clay tablets to the oral traditions of the Americas, the earliest humans describe being visited by beings of enormous physical stature. We see this in the Greek Titans, the Norse Jotun, and the Hindu Daityas. But these beings were not remembered simply as mindless, destructive monsters. They were remembered as the architects of civilization. According to the legends, these oversized figures arrived in the aftermath of the global reset and began to teach. They taught the scattered survivors the cycles of astronomy. They taught them the sudden science of agriculture. And most importantly, they taught them the craft of cutting, shaping, and moving stones of impossible weight. It is easy for the modern mind to dismiss this. We are trained to filter out the supernatural language, to smile at the talk of sky gods and fallen angels. But if we strip away the religious dread of the ancient storytellers, we are left with a very distinct historical core. We are looking at a primitive population trying to describe an encounter with a physically imposing, highly advanced elite. To wave away the global giant myth as a universal psychological fiction is a comfortable luxury. But doing so requires us to completely ignore the physical evidence we just examined. The cultures that told these identical stories of giant teachers just happened to build the identical, inexplicable polygonal megaliths. They shared the same myths, and they executed the same impossible masonry. The story explains the stone. These were not mythological spirits. The evidence suggests they were a real biological population. The giants of our myths were the advanced builders themselves. They were the surviving inheritors of an erased world, using their remaining knowledge to impose order on a broken planet. Mainstream history has successfully reduced them to forgotten fairy tales, but not every ancient source agreed to hide the truth in allegory. Some writers documented exactly who these beings were and precisely what kind of advanced engineering they brought with them. To find that record, we have to look outside the accepted canon and open a text that the early church deliberately suppressed. There is a text that survived the global reset, though the architects of our modern timeline tried very hard to bury it. The Book of Enoch is not a standard mythological tale. It is a forbidden pre-flood manuscript that was systematically stripped from the official biblical canon and pushed into the shadows of history. When you open its pages, it does not read like a purely spiritual document. Instead, it reads like a technical archive. It serves as a detailed historical ledger, recording the exact moment an advanced, powerful caste, a group identified in the text as the Watchers, descended to interact with early humanity. According to the manuscript, these Watchers did not merely observe the earth, and they did not simply demand worship from primitive tribes. They brought a highly specific curriculum. The Book of Enoch states explicitly that these beings taught early humans the complex secrets of metallurgy, the exact mathematical movements of the stars, and the mastery of cutting, shaping, and moving heavy stone. This is the precise combination of advanced sciences required to construct the impossible monuments we see before us. The perfect astronomical alignments, the interlocking polygonal masonry, the 20-ton pillars buried deep at Göbekli Tepe. These are not coincidental anomalies born out of the Stone Age. They are the physical footprints of the Watchers' teachings. The megalithic stones and the forbidden text are describing the exact same forgotten reality, leaving a trace that is undeniable once you know what to look for. And this is precisely why the text had to be erased. The early church institutions and later academic authorities could not tolerate a narrative that shattered their clean, progressive timeline. A historical record documenting a race of giant builders handing down sophisticated engineering right before a cataclysmic flood was far too dangerous to leave in the open. So, the text was locked away, misclassified as a strange apocryphal fantasy, to ensure no one would ever examine its claims about ancient technology too closely. The memory of these builders was not simply lost to the slow, natural decay of time. It was actively and deliberately suppressed to protect a fragile version of human history. But religious canon is only one way to keep a record. While theologians were busy censoring the spiritual archives, they completely overlooked the mundane, bureaucratic ledgers of the ancient world. To find the final, undeniable proof of these impossibly long, godlike reigns, we have to leave the scriptures behind and dig into the baked clay records of ancient Sumer. The search for the vanished builders does not rely only on forbidden scrolls. There is a physical trace left in the ancient city of Larsa, a block of clay that belongs to the rigid bureaucratic world of Sumer. It is known as the Weld Blundell Prism. Carved into its four sides is a text called the Sumerian King List. It begins by calmly stating that kingship descended from heaven, and then it lists the rulers. But the numbers are impossible. One king rules for 28,800 years, another reigns for 36,000 years. These are not the lifespans of ordinary men. They are the measurements of an entirely different type of civilization, one operating on a scale that defies our understanding of biology. The clay prism makes a deliberate physical division in the timeline. It names 8 kings who ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. And then, the text offers a simple, devastating sentence. It reads, "Then the flood swept over. After the waters recede, kingship is lowered from heaven a second time, but the lifespans drop drastically, eventually bleeding into normal human history." This is not a poem, it is an administrative document. The scribes of Sumer recorded these ancient god kings with the same bureaucratic precision they used to count grain shipments and tax records. To them, the pre-flood rulers were literal, historical fact. Mainstream historians look at this clay prism and split it in half. They accept the later kings as real historical figures, but they dismiss the ancient rulers at the top of the list as mythological exaggeration. They treat it as a symbolic fiction. But the scribes made no such distinction. The Sumerian king list is physical proof that the earliest known civilizations remembered the exact moment their world was reset. They knew that a highly advanced, long-lived authority existed before them, and they recorded exactly how that memory was almost completely erased by the flood. If this inheritance was truly global, it should not be confined to the clay of Mesopotamia. We must look west, across the desert, to see if the scribes of Egypt also recorded a pre-dynastic race of gods. The Sumerian clay tablets are not the only records of what came before us. In the archives of the Museo Egizio, there is a fragile papyrus dating to the 13th century BCE, written in fine hieratic script. It is known as the Turin King List. For mainstream historians, it is the ultimate guide to the Egyptian dynasties, a meticulous catalogue of every pharaoh, their years, months, and even days in power. But the document contains a section that modern archaeology prefers to leave forgotten, a vast chronological shadow that predates the official beginning of history. It is an era the Egyptians called Zep Tepi, or the first time. We are taught by standard textbooks to read Zep Tepi as a purely spiritual metaphor, a fairy tale of cosmic creation meant to legitimize later human kings. But the papyrus does not read like a myth. It is formatted as a dry, precise administrative ledger. It describes a literal, physical epoch when the gods did not just exist as abstract concepts in the sky, but walked the earth and governed directly. The text carefully documents a continuous reign of gods, followed by a lineage of demigods known as the followers of Horus. According to this fragile scroll, these beings ruled the Nile Valley for over 13,000 years, long before King Narmer or the first official pharaoh unified Egypt. The numbers are written with the same bureaucratic exactness as the reigns of the recent human kings. This is the exact same anomaly we saw in the Sumerian accounts. Two distinct ancient superpowers separated by vast deserts and fundamentally different cultures independently recorded the same impossible memory. And just like the Sumerian list, this era of Egyptian god-kings ends exactly where the flood of the Younger Dryas cataclysm begins. The catastrophic waters mark the physical boundary of the Great Reset, severing the Golden Age from the scattered survivors. Here, the academic contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Egyptologists treat the latter half of the Turin King list as absolute historical fact. They use it to date the recent pharaohs with unwavering confidence, treating the papyrus as a masterpiece of ancient record-keeping. Yet, when they encounter the older rulers on the exact same piece of papyrus, utilizing the exact same accounting methods, they simply draw an arbitrary line and declare them a myth. They accept the ink that fits the modern model of human development, and ensure the older, more disturbing timeline remains deliberately erased. The accumulating pressure of these ancient texts points to a reality that is much harder for the modern mind to digest. Multiple independent ancient empires recorded the exact same pre-flood history, down to the immense lifespans and the abrupt, violent end of their rule. These ancestral gods were not fictional characters invented over primitive campfires. They were physical, highly advanced rulers whose legacy survived in the guarded archives of the civilizations that eventually inherited their ruins. But papyrus scrolls and clay prisms can always be rationalized away. They can be dismissed by skeptics as religious folklore or political propaganda. If these giant builders truly governed a global network before the Ice Age ended, they must have left a physical trace, something far heavier and more permanent than words. To find their true architectural legacy, we must leave the written archives behind. We have to look for the massive interlocking stones that share their impossible precision, moving our investigation from the Egyptian sands toward the ancient islands of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean island of Malta is a tiny speck of limestone adrift in a vast sea. But long before the Romans, before the Greeks, and before the first dynasties of Egypt, someone here decided to move mountains. The temple complex of Gantija stands as one of the oldest freestanding structures on Earth. The name itself is not a modern tourist invention. In the local dialect, handed down through countless generations, Gantija translates to the Tower of the Giants, and when you stand beneath its towering outer walls, the name feels less like folklore and more like a forensic description. The limestone blocks used to build this sanctuary are truly cyclopean, with some individual stones weighing over 50 tons. To understand what you're looking at, you have to forget the Mediterranean for a moment and look back to the Andes. The blocks in Malta are not merely heavy. They are shaped and fitted with a specific, undeniable logic. It is the exact same architectural syntax we see in the polygonal masonry of Sacsayhuamán in Peru. The stones are irregular, carved with multiple precise angles to interlock perfectly without mortar. They are designed to absorb seismic shock and outlast millennia. Here we have two completely different continents separated by oceans, utilizing the exact same impossible engineering signature. Mainstream archaeology dates the construction of Gantija to roughly 3600 BCE. According to the accepted timeline, this was the work of an isolated primitive island culture. We are told to picture a small group of Neolithic farmers who somehow managed to quarry, transport and elevate stones the size of modern houses. We are told they did this with nothing but ropes and brute force, on an island with limited resources, no advanced metallurgy, and absolutely no prior developmental phase. But when you place the Cyclopean walls of Malta next to the polygonal stones of Peru and the buried 20-ton pillars of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the illusion of isolation collapses. The world is covered in the remnants of a single, unified architectural language. The official narrative demands that we accept an absurdity. It asks us to believe that a primitive island culture independently invented world-class megalithic engineering in a total vacuum, leaving behind no trail of trial and error. The physical evidence points to a far more dangerous reality. The temples of Malta were not an isolated experiment. They are the physical footprint of the exact same legacy, recorded in the Sumerian king list and the Book of Enoch. They are the work of the same surviving pre-flood network. This was a civilization that possessed a global blueprint and the means to execute it across the planet. The stones of Guntia perfectly match the universal memory of an advanced giant race that rebuilt the world after the waters of the Younger Dryas receded. The pressure of the evidence is now accumulating from every direction. We have the suppressed ancient texts, we have the global flood myths, and we have the perfectly interlocking stones spanning from the Mediterranean to the Andes. But architecture and clay tablets can only take us so far. If a unified, advanced civilization of giant builders truly walked the earth, they must have left something more intimate behind in the dirt. If they built these structures, where are their bodies? In the late 19th century, the American landscape was giving up its dead. The 1892 annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, alongside hundreds of local newspaper clippings from the era, documented something that modern archaeology insists does not exist. Think of historical institutions as a massive filter for reality. They decide which puzzle pieces are allowed to remain on the table. When a piece does not fit the timeline already printed on the box, it is not studied. It is quietly discarded. Across the continent, farmers and early excavators were unearthing human skeletons of impossible proportions. The reports consistently described remains measuring between 7 and 12 feet in length. Many possessed strange anatomical anomalies, including heavy, robust jaws and double rows of teeth. The procedure after these discoveries was almost always the same. The bones were carefully excavated, packed into wooden crates, and shipped directly to the Smithsonian Institution for official study. And then, they simply vanished from the public record. It would be easy to dismiss one or two old articles as a frontier hoax. But this was a documented, widespread wave of physical archaeological finds occurring over decades. It happened in the brief window of time just before the modern academic timeline of human origins was rigidly enforced. The chilling realization is that these remains did not crumble into dust upon exposure to the air. They were hidden. It was not a lack of physical evidence that erased the giant builders from history, but a deliberate institutional erasure. The clean, linear story of human progress displayed in our modern museums is not a reflection of everything we have found in the earth. It is a carefully curated reality, protected by making the physical anomalies disappear. But an institution can only hide what fits inside a wooden crate. If the bones were confiscated and locked away in the subterranean vaults, what about the architecture they left behind? What happens to the massive stone burial chambers built to house them? Structures simply too heavy to be moved. On the wind-swept plains of Sardinia, the stones still hold the shape of an impossible memory. They are called the Tombe dei Giganti, the tombs of the giants. These are gallery graves built from cyclopean blocks of basalt and granite, stacked with a weight that defies the landscape around them. To understand the anomaly, you must look at the physical scale. The central corridors of these structures often exceed 10 meters in length, with individual roof slabs weighing dozens of tons. Yet, the official timeline reconstructs the builders as ordinary Neolithic farmers, average men and women who stood roughly 1.5 meters tall. The physical space designed for the dead is fundamentally mismatched to the bodies of the supposed living. And Sardinia is not an isolated case. From the West Kennet Long Barrow in England to the dolmens of the Caucasus Mountains, the same oversized architecture repeats. Across thousands of miles, seemingly unrelated cultures built the exact same massive passage tombs, and everywhere they appear, the local folklore insists on the exact same name. They are universally remembered as the graves of giants. The physical remains of the original occupants may have been erased from the official record, quietly removed or locked away in institutional vaults. But the ancient oral traditions survived the reset. The people who later inherited these lands did not claim to have built the monuments. They pointed to the empty, massive chambers and simply passed down the memory of a larger race that came before us. Mainstream archaeology asks us to accept a very strange contradiction. We are told that primitive, average-sized agricultural workers spent generations dragging stones weighing over 100 tons, just to build cavernous, oversized stone vaults for ordinary people. It is a safe explanation, but it ignores the heavy, physical reality of the architecture. The landscape itself stands as a witness against the consensus. The stones remember what institutions try to forget. The sheer, crushing scale of these tombs demands a builder of immense physical stature, leaving a deep trace of a civilization that built for bodies much larger than our own. But if the architecture of the dead points to a vanished race, we must look for what else escaped the long cover-up. We have to move from the empty stone corridors of Europe to the high deserts of South America, where the forensic evidence of these anomalous builders was not completely destroyed, starting with the elongated skulls of Paracas. The megalithic tombs of the ancient world were built for massive bodies, but the most startling physical evidence does not come from the architecture of the graves. It comes from the biological remains resting inside them. On the arid desert coast of Peru, wrapped in elaborate textiles and buried beneath the dry sand, archaeologists have uncovered a graveyard containing more than 300 elongated skulls. These are the Paracas skulls, and they present a forensic anomaly that cannot be dismissed by standard anthropology. The official explanation is artificial cranial deformation, the ancient practice of tightly binding an infant's head with wooden boards and cloth to permanently alter its shape. And it is entirely true that head binding was a widespread practice in antiquity. But there is a strict mechanical limit to the human skeleton. Binding a skull is exactly like squeezing a balloon. You can change the shape of the balloon, but you cannot increase the total volume of air inside it. Squeezing a human head alters the contour of the bone, but it mathematically cannot increase the internal capacity of the brain case. This is where the Paracas skulls break the biological rules. According to the exhaustive research of Brian Foerster, who facilitated independent testing on these remains, some of these specific skulls possess a cranial capacity up to 25% larger than a modern human being. Furthermore, they are physically missing the sagittal suture, the complex connective tissue joint that naturally divides the human parietal plates. And when researchers extracted deep samples from the bone and hair for testing, they found mitochondrial DNA mutations that do not match any known human, primate, or Neanderthal evolutionary tree. Mainstream historians point to the thousands of normal human skulls found worldwide that show clear signs of artificial binding, using them to wave away the mystery. But the widespread presence of bound human skulls actually deepens the enigma. If ordinary humans were painfully binding the heads of their children across multiple continents, they were doing it to emulate something specific. They were copying a physical trait, desperately attempting to mimic an older, elite race of rulers who naturally possessed these towering, elongated heads. The genetic analysis suggests a deeply unsettling reality. This elite ruling class was not strictly Homo sapiens. The severe mutations point to a distinct non-human lineage, or perhaps an advanced hybrid species that survived the global cataclysm and walked among early human populations. These biological traces force us to reconsider the entire definition of the builders. They were not simply oversized ordinary humans. They were a different branch of life entirely, possessing a physical and genetic architecture just as impossible as the polygonal megaliths they left behind. If an advanced, distinct species lived alongside early humanity, serving as their god-kings and inherited rulers, their physical forms would not just be buried in the desert sand, they would be monumentalized. The question is, how did our ancestors record the faces of these beings before they finally vanished? To find the answer, we have to look thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, to the isolated, impossible statues of Easter Island. On the isolated shores of Easter Island, 887 monolithic statues stand in silence. You look up at the moai, and the sheer weight of the volcanic tuff anchors you to the ground. These figures represent up to 82 tons of solid stone, staring inland, turning their backs to the sea. For decades, the official narrative has categorized these giant monoliths as abstract religious art, or stylized totems of local ancestors. But if you look closely at the physical evidence, They do not read as abstraction. They read as a multi-generational memory project. They are forensic composite sketches, carved in stone by a people desperate to ensure the faces of the ancient rulers would never be forgotten. The anatomy carved into the rock is highly specific. Notice the elongated, massive heads, the heavy, prominent brow ridges, the unnaturally long ears, and the towering stature. These are not merely artistic choices. They are a biological match. The facial structure of the Moai perfectly mirrors the physical anomalies of the Paracas skulls found in Peru. The stones are depicting the exact same beings described in the universal myths of the Nephilim, the giant builders who ruled before the flood. Then there is the mystery of their movement. The mainstream timeline insists that the Rapa Nui people drag these monoliths across the island using ropes and wooden sleds. Yet the local oral tradition has never claimed this. The islanders state clearly that the statues walk to their platforms. It is a detail that sounds like myth to modern ears, but it precisely matches the fragmented global memories of a lost technology. Perhaps acoustic levitation, or a frequency-based transport system that rendered the impossible weight of the stones irrelevant. The official explanation requires us to believe that an isolated, resource-starved population undertook an industrial-scale quarrying operation. We are told they moved 82-ton blocks of stone using timber and ropes, inadvertently deforesting their entire island in the process. But the sheer logistical scale of the enterprise contradicts the capabilities of a primitive society. The mechanical reality of moving that much weight over uneven terrain without heavy machinery simply refuses to align with the official story. The Moai are not the product of an isolated island cult. They are a monument to a vanished race. They represent the survival of the builder's iconography, erected by descendants who were trying to preserve the physical memory of the original gods. It is a desperate, towering archive, carved before the echo of their existence completely faded from the world. But if Easter Island is merely a stone echo, a memory passed down through generations, we are left with a deeper question. Is there an original? Is there an even older, more direct visual record of these beings, recorded by artists who actually saw them alive? To find it, we must step backward thousands of years, away from the Pacific Ocean and into the deep desert of the Sahara, to the 6000 BC cave paintings of Tassili N'Ajjer. The stone faces of Easter Island look out over an empty ocean, holding a memory in solid rock. But stone is not the only medium that survived. To see the builders as the early humans saw them, we must walk into the deep Sahara. In the vast arid cave systems of Tassili N'Ajjer in Algeria, dated to roughly 6000 BC, there is a very different kind of archive. It is a painted first-hand account of the world as it was, long after the great waters of the cataclysm receded. We are routinely conditioned to read prehistoric rock art as abstract mythology. We are told to see it as the frantic imagination of primitive hunter-gatherers. But early humans were, above all, highly pragmatic and literal observers. When they drew a hunt on a cave wall, they drew the animals exactly as they existed in the physical world, capturing the precise shape of a horn or the heavy slope of a shoulder. They were keeping a historical ledger of their environment. So we must ask a very uncomfortable question. If they drew the animals exactly as they saw them, why would we assume they were simply dreaming when they drew giants? High on the sandstone rock face, there is a sprawling panel known as the Great God of Sephar. The central figure is massive. It is painted to represent a humanoid being standing 7 to 9 feet tall. It wears an elaborate, almost technological headdress, filled with details that do not match any known tribal gear. But the most unsettling detail is the context. Gathered around the feet of this massive figure are ordinary human beings. They are drawn entirely to scale, appearing tiny and vulnerable in comparison. They are looking up at a towering physical authority. The artist was not using size merely to imply importance. They were documenting a stark biological contrast. The standard academic reflex is to quarantine this image. We are told it is nothing more than a shamanic trance, or an exaggerated piece of religious art born from the heat of the desert. It is much safer to label it a hallucination than to accept it as a portrait. But hallucinations do not synchronize across oceans. Thousands of miles away, completely isolated from the Sahara, the remote rock shelters of Australia hold the Wandjina and the Bradshaw paintings, and there we find the exact same anatomical hierarchy. Tall, imposing figures with strange halos and featureless faces, towering over ordinary men. This is not a shared psychological glitch. It is a worldwide, synchronized visual record of a physical reality. Early human populations across the globe were observing the exact same phenomenon. They were recording a hierarchy of giants walking among them. The ancients were not inventing myths around the campfire. They were painting portraits. They were leaving behind an explicit visual confirmation of the surviving builders who ruled over them. They captured the memory of a civilization that refused to be completely erased, painting the faces of the beings who inherited the ruins of the pre-flood world. But if these beings were physically real, and if they carried the knowledge of a lost era, what kind of power did they still wield? A portrait on a cave wall tells us what they looked like, but it does not tell us what they could do. To understand the terrifying, inexplicable energy technologies they left behind, we have to look for the physical traces of extreme heat. We have to follow the trail north to the vitrified, melted stone forts of Scotland. In the misty highlands of Scotland, at a site known as Tap o' Noth, the physical evidence shifts from the impossible weight of the stones to the very molecular structure of the rock itself. Here, the ancient walls are not just stacked or fitted. They are fused into solid, bubbling black glass. To understand the scale of what you're looking at, you have to look through the lens of modern metallurgy. Turning solid granite and basalt into liquid glass is a process called vitrification. It requires a sustained, intensely focused heat of at least 1,100 degrees Celsius. That is the exact thermal environment found inside a modern industrial blast furnace. It is the kind of flash heat generated at the epicenter of a nuclear detonation. It is absolutely not the result of a primitive campfire or a burning thatched roof. Yet, at Tap o' Noth, this extreme thermal event did not merely scorch the outer surface of the fortress. The heat penetrated deep into the dense core of the massive stone blocks, melting them together into a single, indestructible mass of fused geology. And this is not an isolated anomaly. There are over 60 of these vitrified forts scattered across Scotland alone, with similar unexplained sites existing in France and Turkey, each bearing the identical, unmistakable signature of extreme thermal energy. The official academic explanation asks us to believe that these walls were originally laced with a timber framework. We are told that accidental fires, or perhaps burning arrows from ancient sieges, somehow melted the rock. But the basic physics of a wood fire refuse to cooperate with this theory. A timber fire burns hot, but it burns out far too quickly in the open air. It simply cannot generate, let alone sustain, the prolonged, concentrated thermal mass required to liquefy solid granite walls that are several meters thick. Experimental archaeologists have tried to replicate this effect using massive wood pyres, and they have repeatedly failed to produce anything more than lightly blackened stones. This metallurgical impossibility leaves us with a terrifying implication. Either the ancient builders possessed an advanced, lost method of thermal engineering designed to deliberately fuse their fortresses into impenetrable single monoliths, or we are looking at the direct blast scars of a highly advanced ancient conflict. Whichever scenario you accept, the conclusion remains the same, and it shatters the conventional timeline. The ancient world had access to, and absolute mastery over, a level of destructive thermal energy that we associate only with the modern industrial, or even the atomic age. The stones themselves record a technology that was entirely erased from human memory. But the ability to manipulate the fundamental structure of stone is only one half of the equation. If a global civilization could wield this kind of extreme power over the physical world, how did they wield power over the human one? To answer that, we must look at how this advanced society imposed its strict hierarchy on the survivors. We must travel to a blueprint of control, perfectly preserved in the sudden, unwalled, and fully formed city of Corral, high in the Andes of Peru. The physical evidence of this lost civilization is not limited to extreme thermal technology or impossible stone weights. Sometimes, the anomaly is the sudden engineering of human society itself. Consider the ancient city of Corral, located in the arid Supi Valley of Peru. Dated to 2600 BCE, it is officially recognized as the oldest known city in the Americas. Mainstream history teaches that human civilization is a slow, messy climb out of the mud. According to the textbook narrative, we begin as hunter-gatherers, form small warring tribes, build protective walls, and eventually, over thousands of years of trial and error, organize into complex cities. but coral completely defies this evolutionary ladder. It appears in the archaeological record like a sudden, fully installed operating system for human society. There is no beta testing. There is no slow accumulation of primitive precursor villages. It simply arrives, fully formed and functioning at a massive scale. The site features 6 enormous stone pyramids, sweeping amphitheatres, and perfectly aligned sunken circular plazas. The construction required tens of thousands of tons of stone to be quarried, shaped, and transported by a highly synchronized labor force. To coordinate such an overwhelming effort requires a rigid social hierarchy, a deep understanding of civic planning, and an unquestioned centralized leadership. And yet, when archaeologists meticulously excavated Corral, they found a glaring, almost impossible anomaly. In a period of antiquity when human tribal development was fiercely territorial and violent, this monumental city has absolutely no defensive walls. There are no battlements, no parapets, no stockpiles of weapons, and no signs of warfare anywhere in the vast archaeological record. For roughly 1,000 years, a massive, highly stratified society lived in total, undefended peace. This presents a profound contradiction. How does a massive labour force organise itself into a strict hierarchy, without the threat of violence or the need for military defence? The peaceful, sudden arrival of this structured urban life suggests something deeply unsettling for the official timeline. It implies that the ruling authority was not a local warlord who fought his way to the top through conquest. Instead, it points to an external authority, a surviving caste of the giant builders, universally respected, who imparted civilization from the top down. The layout of Corral was not painstakingly invented by local tribes experimenting with urban planning. The blueprint was already known. It was an inherited trace of an erased world, an organized pattern imposed upon the scattered survivors of the Great Cataclysm. Civilization here was not a slow climb of discovery. It was an immediate restoration project. But if this surviving elite could suddenly engineer a complex, peaceful society out of the harsh desert, they must have brought more than just civic blueprints. They needed the physical means to carve their monumental legacy into the bedrock. And when we look across the ocean, to the tool marks left on the hardest stones in Egypt, the mainstream story of primitive copper chisels begins to collapse entirely. In the ancient granite quarries of Aswan, Egypt, lies an impossible trace of the builders. It is known simply as the unfinished obelisk. It is a single, towering block of pink granite, still perfectly attached to the bedrock, weighing roughly 1,200 tons. Mainstream history insists that the dynastic Egyptians carved this staggering monolith using simple copper chisels and handheld stones, but the physical reality of the material does not care about historical consensus. On the Mohs scale of mineral hardness, copper is a 3. Quartz-rich granite is a 7. Trying to carve a 7 with a 3 is like trying to slice a diamond with a piece of plastic. The tool will simply destroy itself against the rock. When you walk down into the narrow trench surrounding the obelisk, the mystery deepens. You do not see the shallow, random scratches of manual labour. Instead, the trench walls are defined by massive, repeating curved scoop marks. They run down the vertical face of the bedrock with mechanical precision, looking exactly as if a giant ice cream scoop was effortlessly dragged through the solid rock. The official explanation for this anomaly is that armies of workers spent years crouching in the suffocating trench, violently pounding the bedrock with round dolerite stones. But anyone who has worked with stone knows that pounding shatters rock chaotically. Blunt force creates dust, jagged fractures, and uneven surfaces. It does not and cannot leave perfectly smooth, uniform, curved striations that continue seamlessly down a granite wall. When modern engineers and machinists like Christopher Dunn examine these trenches, they do not see the exhausted work of primitive labourers. They see the unmistakable feed rate of heavy machinery. The geometry of the tool marks indicates a device that removed solid granite like butter. The physical evidence left in the stone points to a lost ultrasonic, acoustic, or chemical machining technology, methods that our own civilization is only just beginning to replicate. The copper chisel theory is a mechanical fallacy. It is a desperate academic attempt to protect a clean, linear timeline from the overwhelming weight of physical evidence. The stones themselves demand an advanced machine age. The dynastic Egyptians did not invent this method of terraforming. They inherited the tools, or perhaps the half-finished site itself, from a much older, highly advanced civilization that was largely erased by the flood. But this realization creates an immediate glaring problem. If a pre-flood society possessed this terrifying level of mechanized power, where is the evolutionary ladder? Where are the early primitive prototypes of these machines? To find the missing developmental sequence, we have to look at how the ancient timeline actually moves. We have to return to the deliberately buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe and watch what happens when human history runs backward. To understand the true scale of what has been lost, we must return to the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe. But this time, we're not looking at the stones. We're looking at the dirt. In archaeology, the layers of soil tell a story of time, with the deepest strata holding the oldest secrets. Imagine digging into the earth and finding a smartphone in the lowest layer of bedrock. Then, in the soil directly above it, you find a telegraph machine. And in the newest layer near the surface, you find evidence of smoke signals. It is a timeline running in reverse. The impossible sits at the beginning, and the further forward you move, the more primitive the world becomes. This is not a thought experiment. This is exactly what the archaeological record reveals at Göbekli Tepe. When Klaus Schmidt and his team excavated the site, they analysed the stratigraphy, the distinct geological layers marking different eras of construction. At the very bottom, in the oldest strata dating back to 9600 BC, they uncovered what they classified as Enclosure C and Enclosure D. These early rings feature the most massive precision-carved T-shaped pillars on the entire hill. These are the stones that weigh up to 20 tons. They are cut with absolute geometric perfection, standing perfectly plumb, and their surfaces are adorned with intricate high-relief animal carvings that would challenge a modern sculptor. Following the standard model of human progress, the layers built above this masterpiece should show even greater architectural mastery. But as the excavators track the timeline forward, moving up into the shallower, younger layers of dirt, they found a steep, undeniable decline. In the newer enclosures, the stones are significantly smaller. The vibrant three-dimensional carvings disappear, replaced by crude, shallow scratches. The placement of the pillars becomes sloppy, losing their perfect astronomical alignments and structural stability. This physical reality destroys the comfortable, linear model of human progress. There is no missing developmental sequence hiding in the soil. There is no evolutionary ladder showing hunter-gatherers slowly figuring out how to cut 20 tons of limestone. The technology at Göbekli Tepe did not evolve. It devolved. What stands on that hill is not the birth of a new architectural science. It is the dying echo of an older, highly advanced one. The evidence clearly suggests that these builders arrived fully formed. They carried the surviving knowledge of a lost world, applying techniques they had already mastered elsewhere. But as those original architects died off, their descendants slowly forgot the methods of their ancestors. They inherited a global science, and over generations they lost it, leaving behind only clumsy imitations of a shattered golden age. But if this megalithic knowledge was an imported inheritance, a remnant of a pre-flood civilization, just how far did it spread? If the survivors carried their science across a devastated planet, they would have left a signature, a mathematical constant hidden in the architecture. To find it, we must look at the statistical proof compiled by the engineer Alexander Thom, who discovered that a single, identical unit of measurement was used to build the ancient world. At Göbekli Tepe, we saw a civilization whose earliest work was its most perfect, only to gradually decay into crude imitations. This missing developmental sequence suggests that the knowledge was not slowly learned, but suddenly inherited. And if it was inherited, it must have left a signature, a mathematical fingerprint that survived the flood. In the middle of the 20th century, an engineering professor from Oxford named Alexander Thom began to look for exactly that. For decades, he surveyed the ruined stone circles of Britain and France. He was not looking for ghosts, or myths, or giants. He was looking for geometry. To understand what he found, imagine walking into a deep jungle, discovering 3 separate, uncontacted tribes, and realizing that they all measure their houses using the exact same modern metric ruler, down to the millimeter. Independent invention can explain why different cultures might build walls. It cannot explain why they would all use the exact same ruler. Yet, when Thom processed the dimensions of the ancient structures, the numbers refused to behave according to the accepted historical timeline. After running a rigorous statistical analysis on over 600 megalithic sites stretching from the islands of Scotland to the coast of Brittany, Tom discovered a constant. The builders were not placing stones at random, and they were not pacing out distances with their feet. They were executing precise architectural blueprints using a standardized unit of measure. Tom called it the megalithic yard. It measured exactly 2.72 feet. The statistical probability of isolated primitive farming communities coincidentally adopting the exact same mathematical unit across thousands of miles of ocean and rugged terrain is practically zero. The megalithic yard was a standard, a deliberate unit of measurement that had to be taught, enforced, and preserved. But this mathematical constant does not stop at the edge of Europe. When archaeologists and engineers examine other corners of the ancient world, the same impossible precision emerges. We see it in the Egyptian royal cubit, a highly sophisticated unit of measure used to construct the Great Pyramid. We see it in the high Andes, where the geodetic measurements woven into the terraces of Machu Picchu reflect a profound understanding of earthly dimensions. These are not isolated local customs. They are fragments of a single, shared source code for megalithic geometry. The mainstream consensus asks us to believe that scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers and early farmers simply guessed their way into identical mathematical systems. We are told that local chieftains, using nothing more than the length of their own forearms or the span of their strides, accidentally synced up their measurements to the millimetre across entirely different continents. But human bodies vary. Pacing out a circle in the mud does not yield a statistical constant of exactly 2.72 feet across 600 separate monuments. The rough trial and error construction of the Bronze Age cannot account for a continental standard of engineering. The megaliths, it turns out, are not just heavy stones dragged into fields for forgotten rituals. They are a frozen mathematical language. They are the surviving physical evidence of a global blueprint, left behind by a single advanced civilization that dispatched its architects across the world before the Great Reset. The mathematical proof is written in the bedrock, waiting for anyone willing to run the numbers. But the builders did not just measure the earth. A civilization possessing this level of unified mathematics would not point their instruments only at the dirt. They would look up. And when we take this mathematical constant and apply it to the astronomical alignments of their greatest monuments, the earthly geometry gives way to something far more terrifying. How did they align this global math with the stars? The megalithic yard proves that these ancient architects shared a terrestrial standard of measurement, but their true scale was cosmic. To see this, we only need to look at the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rests on the plateau, aligned to true north with an error of only 0.05 degrees. Modern engineers struggle to achieve this level of accuracy with laser surveying equipment, yet the builders achieved it with millions of tons of stone. To understand what they truly knew, we must look at a celestial phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes. Imagine the Earth as a slowly wobbling spinning top. As our planet spins on its axis, that axis is not perfectly still. It slowly traces a massive invisible circle in the heavens. Because of this slow drift, the constellations appear to move backward across the sky over vast stretches of time. It takes 26,000 years for this planetary top to complete one single wobble. The Great Pyramid is not simply a mountain of masonry. It is a precise astronomical instrument built to track this immense cycle. As researcher Robert Bauval demonstrated in his study of the Orion correlation, the narrow shafts reaching upward from the inner chambers were not designed for ventilation. They were carefully angled to point perfectly to the star Sirius and to the belt of Orion, locking the monument to the physical sky of a specific ancient era. Aligning a structure to a bright star on a given night is difficult, but it can be done with basic tools. Calculating the 26,000-year cycle of precession, however, is a different matter entirely. It requires centuries of continuous mathematically recorded observation. It is a scientific model built across generations. It is not something a primitive culture simply notices on a single clear night. The evidence suggests that the builders did not just look up at the sky with passive wonder. They understood the deep cosmic mechanics of the Earth's movement. Through its precise geometry, its orientation, and its stellar alignments, they deliberately encoded that 26,000-year planetary wobble into solid limestone and granite. This realization shatters the trial and error hypothesis of mainstream archaeology. We are forced to look at the physical evidence remaining before us. It transforms the Great Pyramid from a simple dynastic tomb into a mathematical library of cosmic timekeeping, preserving the inherited science of a lost age. The builders left us a clock that tracks the slow turning of the universe. But this celestial blueprint raises a much larger question. If these forgotten architects could map the heavens with such impossible precision, could they also measure the Earth itself? We have seen how the Great Pyramid of Giza acts as a cosmic clock, locking onto the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. But the true secret of the monument is not just looking up at the stars, it is anchored deep in the ground beneath it. If you lay out a map of the world and calculate the exact centre of all the habitable landmass on Earth, balancing the continents against the oceans, the lines intersect at exactly one place. The Great Pyramid sits at the precise geographical centre of the planet's landmass. To understand what this means, we have to stop looking at the building as a tomb. We must read it as a textbook in stone. It is a masterclass in geodesy, the science of measuring the Earth. The pyramid is, quite literally, a precise scaled-down mathematical model of the Northern Hemisphere. The builders took the immense curved reality of our planet and elegantly folded it into 4 perfect triangles, projecting a 3-dimensional globe onto a flat stone surface. The scale of this stone model is not arbitrary. It is governed by one highly specific multiplier, 43,200. If you take the perimeter of the pyramid's base and multiply it by 43,200, you get the exact equatorial circumference of the Earth. If you take the original height of the monument and multiply it by that exact same number, you get the polar radius of the Earth, and the numerical impossibilities do not stop at the dimensions. The central latitude of the Great Pyramid is exactly 29.9792 degrees north. In physics, the speed of light in a vacuum is exactly 299,792 kilometers per second. Even if mainstream historians dismiss this as a vast coincidence, the sheer density of these geographical anomalies, compiled by researchers like Graham Hancock, refuses to behave like an accident. This demands a sudden, quiet reset of how we view the ancient world. We are no longer looking at regional architecture or a clever Bronze Age project. We are looking at planetary-scale engineering. To encode the dimensions of the planet into a physical structure with this level of accuracy, the builders had to possess a complete, surveyed map of the globe. They had to know the exact curvature, the polar radius, and the equatorial bulge of the Earth, thousands of years before modern cartography existed. This single structure cements the existence of a highly advanced super-civilization. The Great Pyramid is a deliberate, indestructible monument left by a culture that knew the true, exact size of the natural world and possessed the mathematical language to leave that knowledge frozen in stone. But knowing the size of the world implies something else entirely. If a society possessed this impossible level of scientific and geographical knowledge, they had to develop it somewhere. Where did a civilization capable of mapping the entire globe actually live? The mathematical perfection of the Great Pyramid and the global network of megaliths demand a single point of origin. They point backward, past the boundary of the Younger Dryas, to a world before us, to the antediluvian world, the civilization that thrived before the flood. To comprehend this, we must strip away the modern cartoonish fantasy of Atlantis. We are not looking for a magical kingdom. We are looking at a physical coastal homeland, a landmass that sat just above the lower sea levels of the Ice Age, entirely vulnerable to the warming ocean that surrounded it. In 1882, a researcher named Ignatius Donnelly published a book titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. He did not treat the subject as a fairy tale. He compiled a massive volume of physical and cultural evidence from dozens of isolated societies, matching flood narratives, linguistic roots, and architectural anomalies to argue for a common destroyed source. He anchored his investigation in the oldest surviving records, including Plato's ancient dialogue, the Timaeus. It is a modern reflex to dismiss these ancient texts as moral philosophy or mere metaphor. But the ancients often kept literal historical logs. When they carefully preserved the memory of a drowned land, they were describing exactly what their ancestors had witnessed. This changes the identity of the builders we have been tracking. The architects of the megaliths were not isolated geniuses inventing civilization out of nothing. They were refugees. They were the scattered survivors of a single advanced continent that had been abruptly erased. This revelation provides the missing link. It explains why the same polygonal masonry, the same standard of measurement, and the same astronomical alignments appear on continents separated by vast oceans. It was an inherited blueprint, a preserved trace of a forgotten world carried by those who outlived the reset. But if an entire coastal homeland was swallowed by the sea 12,800 years ago, it did not simply vanish, it sank. And the immediate physical question remains, where are its drowned ruins today? The North Sea is cold, grey, and remarkably shallow, but beneath its waves lies a physical reality that forces us to completely rethink the map of the ancient world. It is a place geologists call Doggerland. To understand the scale of what was lost, you must imagine the current ocean floor not as a barren expanse of sand and salt, but as a sprawling, lush plain roughly the size of modern Britain. 12,800 years ago, you could walk from the eastern coast of England to the shores of Denmark without ever touching the water. This was not an empty wasteland. It was a thriving, inhabited landscape, rich with freshwater rivers, rolling hills, and human life. We know this is true because the evidence is pulled directly from the water. For decades, commercial fishermen dragging their heavy nets across the sea floor have brought up impossible things from the dark. Mammoth bones, carved flint tools, the physical trace of human beings who hunted and built their lives in a world that no longer exists. Today, modern science has validated these accidental discoveries. Extensive seismic mapping, led by researchers like Vincent Gaffney, has scanned the ocean floor, revealing the exact, undeniable contours of these drowned river valleys, ancient lakes, and hills. This creates a jarring contrast with the official story of human origins. When we look at a modern historical map, we are looking at an incomplete fragment. We naturally assume that the earliest civilizations must have started on the land masses we currently see above the water. But human beings have always gathered and settled on the coastlines, at the mouths of great rivers, and in fertile lowland basins. Our modern maps are missing millions of square miles of the exact prime real estate where early civilization would have thrived. The official timeline of history is drawn on a map that has already been erased by the rising waters. This changes where we must look for the origins of the megalithic builders. The heartland of this global network, the missing workshops and the central cities, is not necessarily buried under the shifting sands of the Sahara or hidden deep within the Amazon basin. It is perfectly preserved under hundreds of feet of crushing, freezing ocean water. The timeline was cut in half by a global flood, and the homeland of the advanced civilization was simply swallowed in a matter of weeks. This is the critical shift in our investigation. The concept of an antediluvian world, a sunken continent from the time before us, is routinely dismissed by mainstream institutions as a fairy tale or a philosophical metaphor. But the seismic data from the North Sea, and from similar submerged continental shelves like Sunderland in Southeast Asia, grounds the Atlantis myth in hard, undeniable geology. Drowned worlds are a scientific fact. Entire inhabited landscapes vanished beneath the sea, taking their greatest secrets with them. The memory of the catastrophe survived in our oldest texts, but the physical ground they walked on was permanently reset. The ocean has kept their cities, but the scattered survivors of the flood had to go somewhere. If their original homeland was forgotten, we must ask if the builders left a surviving mark not just in polygonal stone, but inside our own biology. We have to look past the drowned geography of the earth and search the geography of the human body. Did the giants leave a code in our DNA? The sunken continent of Doggerland proves that entire inhabited worlds can vanish beneath the waves, leaving only fragmented traces in the mud. But the most profound map of the ancient past is not geological. It is biological. If we want to find the ultimate record of the lost world, we have to look inside ourselves. Today, it is a documented scientific fact that modern non-African humans carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. When pioneering geneticists like Svante Pääbo began sequencing ancient genomes, they proved that human evolution was not a lonely, linear climb. We did not evolve in pure isolation, we interbred. But as our genetic sequencing becomes more precise, an anomaly has emerged in the data. Biologists call it ghost DNA. Think of it as a biological black box. It is a surviving genetic fragment of an unknown hominid species, a population we have never physically found in the fossil record. We do not have their bones, and we do not have their skulls, but we have their shadow, written directly into our molecular sequence. It is absolute proof that our ancestors encountered someone else, someone entirely distinct from the known branches of the human family tree. And this ghost lineage coincides with sudden, inexplicable leaps in human intelligence. The archaeological record shows rapid, unprecedented expansions in our cognitive capacity. It is as if a missing link species suddenly contributed a massive upgrade to our processing power. This is not just a matter of ancient bone dust blowing across a forgotten excavation site. This is a living archive. It is a sequence of code that is actively operating inside you right now. You are carrying the memory of the builders. This alters the entire landscape of the megalithic mystery. It forces a profound twist in how we read the ancient myths. The universal traditions of the giant builders, the beings described in the Book of Enoch, or the Nephilim of Genesis, who descended to teach humanity astronomy, stonework, and agriculture, take on a terrifying new weight. The evidence suggests that these advanced beings did not merely instruct a primitive human race, they merged with us. The ancient texts describe the sons of God mingling with the daughters of men. For centuries, academics treated this as a poetic metaphor. But the ghost sequences in our DNA suggest it was a literal biological event. The giants did not just build Sacsayhuamán and Göbekli Tepe. They accelerated our cognitive evolution. They left their signature in the architecture of our minds. The mystery of the lost civilization is no longer just an external archaeological puzzle. It is not just about 20-ton stones, buried under the dirt or drowned beneath the sea. It is an internal, biological inheritance. We are the living legacy of a vanished world. The bloodline of the builders survived. But this realization only sharpens the ultimate question. If the builders were so advanced, and if their genetic signature was strong enough to shape the future of humanity, what kind of immense, indiscriminate force was violent enough to wipe their physical civilization off the map entirely? Beneath the surface of the Earth, buried in sediment layers across the globe, lies a thin, dark line. It is a physical boundary composed of soot, platinum, and nanodiamonds, often referred to as the black mat layer. Below this line, the Earth is filled with the bones of giant mammals. Above it, there is nothing. In 2007, a team of scientists led by Richard Firestone published a peer-reviewed study proposing a mechanism for this sudden death. 12,800 years ago, a fragmented comet struck the planet. The impact triggered a global firestorm, rapid cooling, and the immediate violent extinction of the megafauna. To understand the sheer scale of this cataclysm, we have to translate the cold geology into a lived reality. The comet fragments did not just strike the oceans or the rock, they struck the massive continental ice sheets of North America and Europe. The intense thermal shock caused millions of cubic miles of ice to melt almost instantly. This created a wall of water that raised global sea levels by 400 feet. And it happened in a matter of days. If the ancient builders lived in low-lying coastal heartlands, a 400-foot rise means they were instantly erased. Human civilization has always clustered around coastlines, straits, and river deltas. If an advanced global network existed in the world before us, their centers of power were not just damaged by the rising waters. They were swallowed whole. The flood carved entirely new coastlines, leaving absolutely no trace of those original cities above the water. This chilling physical reality forces a profound turn in how we read ancient texts. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Book of Genesis, we are taught to view them as spiritual metaphors. But looking at the geological scarring of the Younger Dryas, a different picture emerges. The hundreds of global flood myths are not mythology. They are literal, traumatized eyewitness accounts. When the ancient Sumerian tablets describe the deafening roar of the waters and the sky turning to pitch black, they are recording the comet impact. These ancient texts are post-apocalyptic survival logs, passed down by people who watched their entire existence wash away. The Younger Dryas impact provides the exact physical mechanism for the missing timeline. The reset was violent, sudden, and complete. The previous world was literally drowned, violently severing the continuity of human memory. Within a few generations, the global megalithic civilization was entirely forgotten, dismissed as a myth by the very people who inherited its ruins. Yet, the highest mountain sanctuaries and the heaviest megalithic stones proved that the destruction was not absolute. A few isolated groups survived. What happened to the desperate survivors who made it through the flood? And how did they attempt to preserve the vanishing knowledge of their drowned world? High in the mountains of Lebanon, beneath the ruined columns of classical antiquity, lies the megalithic site of Baalbek. At its base sits a foundation layer that simply should not exist. It is known as the trilithon, 3 massive, perfectly fitted blocks of cut stone, each weighing roughly 800 tons. They are lifted 20 feet off the ground and placed with a precision that defies modern structural logic. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire claimed this site to build the colossal temple of Jupiter. The Romans are our ultimate benchmark for ancient engineering. They possessed advanced cranes, complex pulley systems, rigorous mathematics, and vast, highly organized armies of labor. Yet when confronted with the trilithon, the Romans did not attempt to replicate it. They could not. Instead, they built their smaller, lighter temple directly on top of the older platform. The greatest empire of the known world was essentially squatting on the ruins of something vastly more powerful. They were baffled by the foundation they built upon, unable to move 800-ton stones, and entirely unable to match the scale of the forgotten architects. This is not an isolated architectural quirk. It is a documented archaeological pattern of devolution. We see the exact same regression at Göbekli Tepe. There, the oldest enclosures, carved more than 11,000 years ago, feature the most exquisite, perfectly balanced 20-ton pillars. But as the centuries passed, the builders did not improve. They devolved. The later layers of Göbekli Tepe feature smaller stones, cruder carvings, and sloppier geometry. Time moved forward, but human capability moved rapidly backward. It is a profound and tragic contrast. We are conditioned to believe that time naturally brings progress, but the physical record reveals the opposite. It shows a desperate remnant of survivors trying to hold on to a fading technological inheritance. They carried the memory of how the old world operated, but without the deep infrastructure, the missing workshops, and the advanced tools of their drowned homeland, they could only create crude imitations. Generation by generation, the original methods slipped through their fingers. The incomprehensible machines stopped working. The intricate processes were abandoned. The remaining blueprints were elevated into sacred, unreadable relics, and the giant builders who survived the cataclysm were eventually worshipped as divine beings. What the earliest human chroniclers dutifully recorded as the miraculous magic of the gods, stones that levitated, celestial chariots, and weapons of terrifying heat, was never magic at all. It was simply forgotten physics and lost engineering. This realization completely dismantles our comfortable linear view of the past. The accepted academic timeline insists that humanity climbed a straight, steady ladder out of the caves, moving from simple tools to complex cities in a neat upward trajectory. But the shattered megaliths of Baalbek and Göbekli Tepe prove that this timeline is an illusion. We are not looking at the dawn of human progress. We are looking at the long, slow tale of a devolution. It is a clear, undeniable downward slope in capability that followed the violence of the global flood. The ancient builders reached a global peak, and then the waters erased them, leaving us to inherit their ruins. But if history is not a straight line pointing steadily upward toward the present, we have fundamentally misunderstood our place in the story. If the timeline is broken, what is the actual shape of human time? The tragic fading of ancient knowledge, the inability of later empires to replicate the massive stones of Baalbek, or the clear devolution of the intricate carvings at Göbekli Tepe, is not a localized historical accident. It is the physical signature of a much larger, far more terrifying pattern. We are conditioned by modern academia to view time strictly as an arrow. We are taught that human progress shoots in one direction, climbing steadily from primitive wandering tribes toward the absolute peak of modern technological supremacy. But the ancient world did not see a linear arrow. They saw an inescapable wheel. To understand the mindset of the builders, we have to understand time as a massive cosmic clock, a rotating celestial mechanism that dictates the inevitable rise and fall of human consciousness, engineering, and civilization itself. In the ancient Hindu cosmology preserved in the sprawling texts of the Vishnu Purana, this grand clock is divided into 4 distinct world ages, known as the yugas. With each sequential turning of the wheel, humanity slowly descends from an original, highly advanced state of Golden Age clarity. As the centuries pass, the unified global knowledge fragments. The monumental polygonal architecture devolves into crude, mortar-bound imitations. And eventually, the cycle always terminates in a sudden, violent planetary cataclysm. a synchronized purge of extreme fire and global flooding that clears the board for the next rotation. According to these ancient guarded records, we are currently navigating the final, most degraded phase of this cycle. It is known as the Kali Yuga, an age defined by conflict, discord, and a profound historical amnesia, which officially began in the year 3102 BC. It is incredibly easy for modern historians to dismiss the concept of the Yugas as mere religious allegory, a poetic metaphor for the hardships of early life. But this mythological framework perfectly matches the physical, geological scars we have tracked across the planet throughout this investigation. The concept of a repeating, destructive cycle maps flawlessly onto the sudden, violent temperature spikes recorded deep in the Greenland ice cores. It explains the global nanodiamond layer and the black mat of the Younger Dryas impact boundary, and it finally answers the uncomfortable archaeological reality of why the oldest layers at megalithic sites are always the most mathematically and artistically sophisticated. The buried stones, the shattered ice, and the forbidden texts are all recording the exact same ruthless historical mechanism. This alignment between hard geology and ancient myth forces a profoundly humbling realization. Our modern, globalized era is not the triumphant apex of the very first human civilization. We are not the pinnacle of a single, unbroken timeline. We are simply the amnesiac survivors of the fifth, or perhaps the seventh iteration of humanity to build sprawling cities upon this earth. The mystery of the megalithic network expands from a single forgotten disaster into an inevitable, terrifying cosmic law. The human story is not a steady, triumphant march forward. It is a repeating loop of cataclysm, survival, and a subsequent reset. And if the Yuga cycle is a literal mechanical reality, if the exact same cosmic clock that governed the rise and fall of the ancient builders is still ticking silently in the background of our own era, it leaves us with one final unavoidable question. Where exactly are we on the wheel right now? Today, the very same skies that the ancient astronomers watched with such obsessive precision are being monitored again. Modern space agencies map near-Earth asteroids, and physicists track the rising instability of the Sun. These threats are not theoretical. They are physical realities. We watch solar flares graze our atmosphere, and we track wandering rocks that cut across our orbit, narrowly missing the Earth. The builders of the ancient world worked in polygonal granite and basalt. They erected walls weighing tens of thousands of tons, engineered to withstand massive earthquakes, and yet they were entirely erased. If a civilization of giants, capable of moving mountains, could be shattered in a single day, we must look at our own world. Our modern society is not carved from solid stone. It is built on a fragile web of digital data, copper wires, and a highly vulnerable electrical grid. If the sky falls again, our servers and satellites will not last a fraction of the time that Göbekli Tepe survived. The modern astronomical consensus offers no comfort. The math is cold and unforgiving. Statistical models of our solar system indicate that major cosmic events, impacts from 100-meter asteroids capable of triggering global firestorms and tsunamis, occur roughly every 10,000 years. The Younger Dryas impact, the event that burned the atmosphere and melted the ice caps, happened exactly 12,800 years ago. We are statistically overdue. This is the context that makes the ancient texts so deeply unsettling. The global flood myths, the warnings preserved in the Book of Enoch, the Hindu Yuga cycle describing the inevitable end of every world age, these were not poetic metaphors or religious fantasies. They were desperate, literal survival records. The ancestors were trying to tell us that the sky can and will fall. The exact precursors those legends warned about, the changing of the seasons, the instability of the sun, the trembling of the earth, are happening in our skies today. The most terrifying realization is not that an advanced civilization existed before us. It is the realization that the catastrophe that destroyed them was not a one-time anomaly. The same cosmic forces that erased the megalith builders have not gone away. They are still out there circling in the dark, governed by the relentless mechanics of the solar system. The clock did not stop. It merely reset. We have spent our modern era believing we are the pinnacle of a long, unbroken line of human progress. But the physical evidence beneath our feet tells a much darker story. The map of history is not a straight line ascending into the future. It is a wheel. We are just the current layer, standing on the buried ruins of a forgotten world, waiting for the memory of our own achievements to be washed away. The past is not gone, and the cycle will return. We are forced to look at the towering stones of Baalbek, the sunken plains of Doggerland, and every silent, heavy trace of that lost age, and ask the only question that remains. Are we the next reset? And when the waters finally recede, what will survive of us?